The EVGA RTX 2080 Ti Kingpin card is EVGA's crowning engineering achievement for this generation. As always, the KP cards aren't necessarily meant for people who, well, they aren't meant for people who just want a card and don't have any personal or enthusiast interest in overclocking or playing around with it. And in addition to this review, tomorrow's video will have us gaming with liquid nitrogen on this card. So we're extreme overclocking, but actually doing gaming benchmarks through our standard suite. You'll want to check back for that, especially if you're one of the people who says liquid nitrogen overclocking is pointless. You can't play games with it, because we're proving you wrong. This is a card for people who really want to get low level with hardware and into the weeds, and today we're testing it as it was meant to be tested. Our review looks at the Kingpin card for quality under liquid nitrogen, but also looks at normal use cases, like straight out of the box performance, thermals and power performance, and overclocked gaming performance with stock water loops, but again also LN2. This card allows users to completely remove the power limit from NVIDIA architecture, the bane of our existence, and we're looking to see if it's worth it and for whom it might be worth it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their high-end thermal compounds. Thermal Grizzly makes cryonaut paste for high thermal performance and conductivity without being electrically conductive, so you don't have to worry about shorting components. Cryonaut is particularly good for replacing stock GPU pastes, as Cryonaut is a non-curing compound. Learn more at the link in the description below. We've done a lot of coverage of this card. It's currently coated in Vaseline for overclocking. Stop it. So the card we previously looked at, we did a teardown of it. You can check that separately, but we'll talk a bit about it here. We did the BuildZoid coverage of its PCB and VRM quality, and they're very high. It's a well-built card, but it's extremely expensive. And that means that most people will probably look at it and scoff at the price. And that's fine, because it's really not meant for average use. It's not meant for someone who would buy a 2080 Ti FE or XC Ultra or something like that. This is meant for overclockers, for enthusiasts, and although it can be overclocked without LN2, of course it excels with LN2 or exotic cooling. But the lack of power limits, the added tools for voltage control do give you some additional power with just the stock cooler, which is a 240mm CLC. At $1,900, this is one of the most expensive video cards on the market. You have the Titan RTX above it, and then we're not counting things like Quadros. So Titan RTX is about $2,500. This, however, is capable of outperforming the Titan RTX even without LN2 in gaming workloads. Now, it's still a lot of money, so yeah, it's cheaper, but you're talking $1,900. And the improvements versus a stock XC Ultra or something might not really be worth it to you, but that's because it's not meant to be used that way. So the way this card is really properly used is by playing around with it. And what you can do with this one that you can't do with a lot of the other cards is things like add the XOC BIOS. You can completely eliminate the NVIDIA power limit. And even if you're not doing exotic cooling, you can still take the CLC, which is a 240mm Asetek CLC, and we can show that in B-roll a bit, and that comes with a cold plate on it that's a bit modified, so it's got a protruded cold plate. We'll talk about that more later, but it's a flatter surface. It works better with GPUs that are exposed die rather than an IHS, which has a slight curvature to it. So that's beneficial for cooling. And then it's got this larger VRM fan on as well. So if you care about stock performance, you can overclock it pretty damn high, and we'll go through those numbers with the stock cooler on it. You can also run the noise levels fairly low with an overclock that's pretty high, and that's because of the 240 CLC, large fan on the VRM, and then there are ICX sensors if you want to look at things like the thermals of memory of the VRM. Frankly, it's not that important to look at those because they'll be under control, so it's not like you can really do anything with the information, but it's cool to look at, and they do use NTC thermistors for those, which we've previously validated to be accurate to the real world. So it's not like it's some BS marketing. Those are actually the temperatures. It's just that what you can do with that information under stock use, it's pretty limited. It's just cool to know, hence being an enthusiast card. You're paying for features that are just interesting, not necessarily practical. And that's fine. There are practical features too, though. And the power limit's one of them, but being able to effectively get an extreme overclocking card out of the box without having to do any hard mods yourself is the real value add of an XOC card, whether that's Galax or whether that's something like the KP card. And this is something that often gets overlooked in just when users are commenting on these types of products. So to go back over the basics, in the XOC live streams we did, we got up to 2580 megahertz. That's really high. The stock frequency of something like an XC Ultra is under 2000 megahertz, and that's a higher end 2080 Ti as well. When you overclock, most 2080 Ti's on the market, they tend to stop at around maybe 2050 megahertz, plus or minus about 50 megahertz. 2050 is about where we see the mean. And excursions from that mean are rare and often negative, not positive. So this card, that's with an overclock, by the way, this card runs at about 2040 megahertz out of the box. Now, does that impact your performance a lot? Not necessarily. We'll talk about that in the numbers today. But it gives you a higher starting point for overclocking, at which point you can sort of springboard to 2500, 26 megahertz, and potentially beyond. These GPUs are also binned. We have footage of an MSI binning tool that was at one of MSI's factories. EVGA uses something similar. It's not the same thing to our understanding, but EVGA uses a similar tool to take the individual GPUs, and we've seen trays and trays of those, put it into a socketable tester, and then validate the performance. If it's a good chip, it goes into a KP card. If it's not as good of a chip, it might go into something like a Black Edition card where you're not really guaranteed a high clock, or maybe an XC Ultra if it's kind of good but not XOC good. So these are binned and pre-selected, and Kingpin, who's one of the leading overclockers, is heavily involved in the process of setting those parameters and working through the cards. In fact, a lot of these were pre-tested by Kingpin, especially the early ones, or at least the ones that went out to some of the media. So let's get into the numbers. We'll talk about how the overclocking works, go through our OC stepping chart, get through the gaming benchmarks for fun, thermals, and power, and talk conclusions. Here's how the Kingpin card works. The card has 3 BIOS switches. By default, the switches include a regular, OC, and LN2 vBIOS. But even the LN2 vBIOS isn't really ready for LN2. For that, you'll want the XOC vBIOS, which is made available on xdevs.com. XDevs is run by Tin, one of the 2 evil geniuses behind the Kingpin card, and has an incredible guide about how the card works. Even if you don't want to buy the card, but you're just interested in learning about hardware, this is an excellent starting point to learn some more about how GPUs work. The guide is honestly one of the most in-depth we've seen on the internet. The XOC vBIOS is password protected. The password is, again, I promise not to RMA this card, indicating exactly why it's not on the card by default. As for the vBIOS differences, the regular vBIOS runs a hybrid fan speed range of 0 to 48%, running quieter, with VRM fan speed at 20 to 53%. You just don't need more with that vBIOS. And there's a table on Tin's site that has this information. The fan stops under idle load, whereas OC and LN2 vBIOS options never stop the fan and run higher speeds. Power limit is still 360 watts on all of them, and the power target is 144% max on all of them. There's no thermal protection on the LN2 switch, but the others have it. The XOC vBIOS gets rid of the power target. It's just 100% all the time. All of that said, you'll still run into NVVDD OCP, or the GPU core voltage over current protection, which can be forced off with EVGA's classified tool. The classified tool is what we used during our XOC stream to tune the voltages for the card, and it makes available NVVDD, which is effectively vCore, FBVDD, which is memory voltage, and PEX voltage. These can be tuned even without the XOC vBIOS, and NVVDD OCP can be disabled with this tool. We had to turn it off when tuning the voltage to the core as we hit the maximum current quickly, but the card can still handle more. You'll want to keep vCore under 1.3 volts when not using exotic cooling. Here's our OC stepping chart. The chart is split into peak frequency, the average frequency with a given set of settings, temperature during the run, which will fall between crashes, NVVDD, power target, and more. Note that the power target is removed with the XOC vBIOS, as there is no power limit in this mode. With the regular vBIOS, we found that we were last stable in row 12 at about 2145 megahertz average frequency. This is damn good for a starting point, but we knew that we could improve it with more work. Ultimately, the regular vBIOS and LN2 vBIOS don't actually change a whole lot for non-XOC overclocking, and even with, it doesn't matter, it just doesn't change a lot, but we switched anyway to run higher fan speeds and remove some of the protections. With the LN2 vBIOS, our final stable result was 2160 megahertz average frequency, or about 2220 megahertz peak frequency. we tended to bounce between 2160 and 2205 depending on the workload at any given second. The power as measured by GPU-Z read 377 watts, but we know this to be somewhat inaccurate, so you can mostly ignore that column. We'll instead refer you to our power tests later in the video. We found that NVVDD was actually limiting us more than it was helping, so we set it back to auto and ran 1080 millivolts. The reason for this is because the voltage begins to pull away power from the core. After all, wattage is equal to volts times current, and increasing the voltage to the core will reduce how many watts we have available to actually boost the clock. It goes negative. So you get diminishing returns and then negative returns if you push the voltage too high. We also had some black screen issues, which we eventually traced back to NVVDD with OCP on. So the next step was to use the XOCV BIOS and then disable OCP, although you could do this without the XOCV BIOS if you wanted. For this testing, all with the stock cooler, we found the max stable configuration to be 2205 MHz core and 1460 MHz offset on the memory. We couldn't get the next step stable, and so settled here with a 1.2 NVVDD. Raising to 1.25 didn't seem to help, nor did 1.3, and so our next step was liquid nitrogen. We'll show some live stream clips for this section. Working with experienced overclocker Joe Stepanzi, aka Bearded Hardware, on YouTube, we were able to get the card up to a respectable 2580 MHz core and offset of 1500 to 1600 MHz memory. We found that the card was difficult to keep stable at minus 130 degrees Celsius and below, like below as in below minus 130, not towards zero, but that targeting instead, minus 120 to minus 124 degrees did the best for our card. We also used minus 115 earlier and were able to get pretty high with that, but needed the extra 10 degrees to push further. Note also that this result was after streaming for about 4 hours, so you'd do much better if you didn't chicken clock it like we did for entertainment purposes and pushed it hard out of the gate. Either way, we ended up at about 1.4 NVVDD and 1.5 for FBVDD with PECs at 1.113, and we ended up increasing our scores from a baseline by 23% with the overclock to 2580 MHz. So there's still scaling here, at least in TimeSpy Extreme. This test is among the most important for the Kingpin 2080 Ti, as it establishes what the card's resting frequency is when under a heavy workload. For most 2080 Ti cards, we see variable frequency with a range of about plus or minus 100 MHz from baseline as a result of either inadequate cooling or a heavily power-limited VBIOS. We'll plot the 2080 Ti FE frequency first to establish the trend. The FE card falls from a peak frequency of about 1920 MHz at the start, ending closer to 1770 MHz when under load. The reason behind this is twofold. Although the GPU isn't hitting its hard throttle at 87 degrees Celsius, it is encountering boost tiers all the way up to its resting temperature. Roughly every 5 degrees Celsius, plus or minus a bit, will result in a higher boost frequency, and so the same card running at 50 degrees would operate at a higher frequency, despite potential power limitations. The second part of the equation is the power limit, where NVIDIA's FE card is becoming bound by how much power it is allowed to pull by the VBIOS limitation that NVIDIA set. Plotting the Kingpin card now, we see a perfectly flat line, which is what you want to see. The card starts at about 2080 MHz, but as it heats up to its resting temperature, it settles at 2040 MHz baseline. 2040 MHz versus the 1770 MHz of the FE card is a considerable improvement and is responsible for many of the gains you'll see in today's charts. We saw an improvement by sticking our FE card underwater, not shown here, but then it became power limited while using as much thermal boosting headroom as it could. Plotting temperatures next, the KP card heats up to about 50 degrees Celsius and stays there, whereas the FE card runs closer to 75 degrees before eventually dropping clocks to rest at 73 degrees Celsius. This next chart looks at the Kingpin fan response versus temperature curve. Having a low temperature in itself isn't really all that impressive, as any 3000 RPM set of fans can achieve that, but doing so with reasonable RPMs is the hard part. With a 240mm CLC, that gets much easier. The GPU temperature is plotted on the left axis, where we see the card sitting in the range of 50 degrees Celsius. The GPU fan spins up from about 600 RPM resting speed to 1100 RPM when under load for this version of the VBIOS and the regular VBIOS on the card. The fans can spin over 2000 RPM at max speed, so for auto settings to maintain 50 degrees Celsius at 1100 RPM is pretty damn good. The VRM fan stays at around 1000 RPM and hardly moves with regard to its speed, as the VRM is overbuilt already to the point of not really needing much cooling under these conditions. As for why it cools so well, a lot of it has to do with the GPU cold plate on the CLC. We previously talked about this in an old EVGA hybrid cooler teardown we did, but to recap, EVGA is using an Asetek CLC for the new 2080 Ti Kingpin card with a modified cold plate. The cold plate has a protrusion on the bottom to contact the GPU using a flatter surface than can be found in CPU CLCs. For a CPU cooler, which is what almost all of the CLCs are built for, the cold plate is very slightly curved by Asetek's supplier to match the curvature of the IHS of a CPU. For GPUs, because the die is directly exposed without an IHS, it's better to mate the die to a flat surface, which would be the protrusion in the cold plate. That helps contact to the GPU and improves thermals as a result. For power consumption testing, we're looking at total system power at the wall as logged through in Ashes of the Singularity 4K highly intensive workload. Although this is total system power, we've controlled all of the exposed voltages in the system and use an identical bench each time, which allows us to look at the deltas system to system to get relative accuracy of GPU power consumption. The 2080 Ti Kingpin system, left to its stock configuration and regular VBIOS, ends up pulling about 455 to 470 watts from the wall during these test runs. The VBIOS has a power limit of about 360 watts when stock, and even that still limits the KP card more than the VRM ever will. XOC BIOS is needed to really push it hard because the LN2 and the OC BIOS both have a 360 watt limit. During our live stream when nearing the 2580 MHz peak with 1.3 to 1.4 NVVDD core voltage, with memory at 1600 MHz offset, we measured a peak power consumption of just the video card, not the system, at 670 to 700 watts. We'll look at this more when we do our next content piece on the KP card, but obviously that's a lot of power draw. That's more than we're seeing here for the entire system when it's left to stock conditions. Component temperatures also stay within reason, unsurprisingly, when operating stock or with a non-XOC overclock. We observed stock thermal performance under a torture workload at about 50 to 60 degrees for the memory, depending on which module was measured, and 37 to 55 degrees for the power components. In our original ICX coverage of the SC2 and FTW3 1080 Ti cards, we validated that EVGA's NTC thermistors are accurate and read similar values as our own externally installed probes. Considering the power components could take up to and over 125 degrees Celsius, these readings are all about as good as they can get under a stock cooler like this one. In F1 2018, the Kingpin 2080 Ti stock card runs at 113 FPS average, which actually puts it ahead of the stock Titan RTX and roughly tied with our water-cooled 2080 Ti FE overclock. At 113 FPS average, the 2080 Ti KP leads the XE Ultra on 430.39 by an impressive 7.3%, and that's with both stock. With the KP card overclocked under just the OC BIOS, the card managed to lead the charts at 122 FPS average. That puts it ahead of an overclocked Titan RTX by 2.7% and ahead of the XE Ultra overclock 118 FPS average by 3.3%. Considering we're still talking about a 2080 Ti here, not some new GPU, that's good scaling and shows the benefit of a higher end card, although the value is obviously a tremendously different story and one that we'll talk about more in the conclusion. Sniper Elite 4 at 4K and high settings is next, using asynchronous compute in DirectX 12. In this workload, the stock Kingpin 2080 Ti again outperforms the Titan RTX, once again by about 7.4%. So far, we're seeing consistent spacing here. The 2080 Ti Kingpin stock card's 120 FPS average also outperforms the stock 2080 Ti XE Ultra by 10.5%. Overclocking the XE Ultra puts it up to 126 FPS average, although it wasn't able to sustain as high of an overclock in Sniper 4 as in the other games. The Kingpin overclock pushes it to 131 FPS average, but its 0.1% lows have fallen as a result of an unstable memory overclock. We could further fine-tune this, although in this instance, Sniper Elite 4 is more abusive than other games, and we would lose about 1 FPS to 2 FPS average off the top as a result. Still, overall, it's pushing further than other cards we've tested here. Let's look at the frame times to illustrate the instability in our memory overclock. Just to be clear, this is on us, not on the card itself, as we pushed it to an unstable level with this VBIOS and this power target available. But it's important to show. The reason this is important is because it illustrates why frame time testing is necessary to see how the gaming experience is to the user. If we had only looked at averages, the experience would look much better with the 131 FPS average number, and the frame time dips that cause stutter would be obscured or hidden, as they were. Plotting the Kingpin stock card, we see overall highly consistent frame-to-frame intervals, with frame times averaging in the 8.5 to 9 millisecond range. This is among the best stock performance we've tested for a single GPU, and the high consistency shows that the card isn't pushed to unreasonable limits out of the box. Plotting the overclocked test for the KP card, we begin encountering excursions from the mean frame time upwards of 8 to 10 milliseconds, which becomes visible to the player as small stutters or hitches. These happen almost in predictable intervals, and it appears to be because the memory clock was unstable in Sniper 4. These spikes are what create the worst 0.1% value despite the average FPS. Finally, plotting the 2080 Ti Xe Ultra OC, we get an example of a more stable overclock that still encounters occasional hiccups. For this one, we also had to drop the memory OC as it was able to hold higher in other games. There are no major spikes in this one, but it's the result of spending more time fine-tuning for gameplay. The KP card ends up with better averages, but we're 0.1% low. And this could be made equal or better than the Xe Ultra by spending more time fine-tuning the clocks. That said, our focus for that was more on XOC with this card, so we didn't spend too much time stock tuning. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K places the Kingpin 2080 Ti stock card as outperforming the Titan RTX by about 3.2%. Considering the Titan RTX costs $2,500, that's not bad, although we must fairly state that the Titan RTX is really intended for other workloads with its memory capacity. Regardless, a 2080 Ti outperforming a Titan RTX under stock conditions is a good starting point. The 2080 Ti Xe Ultra operates at 71 FPS average, with the 2080 Ti FE stock card at 68 FPS average. Once we overclock the KP card to its maximum stable offset with the stock OCV BIOS, the card ends up at 82 FPS average, surpassing the Titan RTX overclocked 78 FPS average by 4.2%, and outmatching the 2080 Ti Xe Ultra and FE overclocked results by 3.3%. Installing the XOCV BIOS and overvolting would give you a bit more room, but you have to be careful of cooling requirements. Our 0.1% lows dip here as a result of an imperfect overclock. The memory is bordering on stable and throwing occasional errors, which results in the dip. Further fine-tuning can eliminate this issue once again, although the average frame rate is about as good as it'll get without the XOCV BIOS. So we tested other games than those, but you get the idea. We can stop there. Couple percent improvement on average over the 2080 Ti overclocked cards. It's actually better on average than a Titan RTX full stock. Some games this might not be true. It depends how much they care about the additional cores versus the additional frequency, and frequency does play a big role. So as you can see with things like 1660 versus 1660 Ti overclocking versus 2070 or 2060 overclocking, where you start bumping like a 2060 towards a 2070 with just higher frequency. It matters a lot. So is it worth it? Well, frankly and honestly, for a lot of people, the answer is no. And EVGA is also pretty comfortable with stating this, because this is not a card that, I mean, probably a lot of people do this, but it's really not the sort of thing you're supposed to just buy, put in the system, and never work with again. It's there's too much effort that goes into the PCB. VRM quality is too good. The overclocking guides are extremely good. The ones written by Tin from ex-devs from EVGA, really, but it's too good, that stuff, to not take advantage of it. So if you are planning to plug the card in, and then maybe you think you'll just slide the power target to 144 and never do anything else, we'd honestly say skip this card, save the money, and buy something else. But if you have an interest, even a beginner interest in overclocking, it's something you should consider. This is something that you would want to purchase for actually, working with, getting hands-on with, and the classified tool is good to tune the voltages. If you've never done that before, read the XDev's guide and be careful, because you can start killing things. There's a reason the XOCV BIOS is password protected with a password that is, I promise not to RMA my card. But yeah, this is clearly not something for the dailies, as Vince likes to call them, although you could certainly buy it for that point. You would be overspending, and it's honestly not worth it if that's who you are. But overclocking this, as an enthusiast who's worked with a lot of these video cards, it was genuinely more fun than the average 2080 Ti, and that's because with the average 2080 Ti or any other 20 series card, it gets, once you've done like 20 of them, which is probably about what we're up to, you start to realize they're all about the same. They all stop at the same place. It's about 2050, maybe 2115 megahertz if you're kind of on the higher end. And it's the same steps to do it. It takes 15 minutes once you're experienced with it, and then that's it. That's what the card can do. You're done, unless you can get a custom VBIOS. And the KP card gives you more room. So with the liquid cooler, without the XOC BIOS, we pushed up towards about 2200 megahertz, and then we start becoming power limited. You can increase the voltage at that point, but then you'll probably hit OCP, but you can use the classified tool and turn that off. You should run a level 0 LLC if you want to run on the high end, but you can obviously decrease that a bit if you want lower LLC for, just concerned about stability. But you can turn off OCP, you're still gonna hit a power limit. So then the next step is install the XOCP BIOS, read the guide, be careful not to go too crazy on the temperature or the voltage because you can damage things easily and it would be your fault at that point. But you can install the XOCP BIOS and not even under XOC conditions, you can still push it further. So this is something that gives you some room to play without LN2. It's a really high-end beginner approach if you wanted to do that. But once you feel confident and comfortable with overclocking the card, you can start pushing exotic cooling, dry ice, or LN2 or something like that. Anyway, the card is a lot of fun to work with for overclocking. It's more exciting or interesting than the other 2080 Ti's with the CLC on it. And that's because you genuinely can get more out of it. And it also allows you some more dials to play with, which as an enthusiast is exciting because we're used to NVIDIA stuff being completely locked down. A lot of that's on NVIDIA. EVGA with these cards and some of the other competitors with similar cards like Galaxy Hall of Fame, they can start working around some of those limitations in a way that you really can't with a mainstream card. So that's the right audience for this. It's someone who gets a lot of fun and entertainment out of playing around with these things, and you maybe feel like Turing has been a bit of a letdown thus far. This breaks those rules because it doesn't have to follow them. So that's your ticket out, but it's an expensive ticket. We would say the price is fair for the hardware you get, and it's fair for the performance you can get if you're into competitive benchmarking and overclocking, or if you're into enthusiasts just kind of tweaking around with the hardware. Obviously, fair and worth it will depend on you and what you're doing. The price is fair insofar as the hardware. It's worth it if you're doing all the things I just described, and it's not worth it if you're just going to plug a card in and then put a solid panel on the case and never look at it again. So that's our Kingpin 2080 Ti review. This is a really difficult thing to review because it's really complex. If you want to learn more, watch our PCB and VRM analysis by Buildzoid. He goes into incredible depth on the card. We also have a teardown on the channel separately. That'll give you over an hour of content on this. And then if you really want some more after that, we've got an XOC overclocking recap from our live stream that talks about the steps we went through to get to about 2600 megahertz. And if you want still more than that, we've got a 4-hour live stream archive, so have fun. But that should give you a pretty start to finish look at the card, and we're happy that this was the first product we've done a review on that had XOC data in it. So Kingpin, thanks for sending it over, and Joe, thanks for not destroying it, because I know you really, really wanted to. So that's it for this one. Links below for the article and additional information. Subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or store.gamersnexus.net if you would like to pick up one of our mod mats. We'll see you all next time.